In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Luther the monk. What would it have been like for him to be a monk in the Augustinian order? What were his days like, and how did Luther take to this new life that he had chosen for himself against the wishes of his father? Well, we pick up now where we left off with our lecture on Luther and the thunderstorm. 1505, Luther enters the Augustinian order, and he spends his first year as a probationate. And this is very common, even to this day, that monastic orders don't simply receive anyone into their midst simply on the first impression of that person wanting to join the order, but rather they give them a period of time where they live amongst the monastic order, they do a majority of the things that a monk is required to do, and after a period of time, in this case a year, they can then be received into the order fully, taking their vows and making the permanent step to finally becoming a monk. It's a bit like the context of the movie Sound of Music. I can remember as a kid scratching my head a bit that why was a nun being sent off, and my childhood mind was a little bit scandalized that a nun had decided to marry. But now that I have my own kids and have rewatched the movie, I now know what's going on. Maria von Trapp in that movie is a probationate, and the Mother Superior essentially says, "You're not meant for the monastic life. You need to find a life outside of these walls." Well, in the case of Luther, he goes through the first year of the probationate, and he's received in 1506. And he takes his vow, and he becomes an Augustinian monk. Now, Luther would hold these vows all the way until the time of the Reformation, when it gets going. It's worth noting at this point that Luther actually never rescinds his vows. He never breaks them in the fullest sense of the word. That's one of the myths that's always out there, that Luther somehow cast off the monastic order and went trampsing off by himself to become a married Protestant man. Actually, in 1520, to spare the order the ignominious reputation of having Luther in their midst, and, in many ways, to free Luther up to do more things, the vicar general of the order, Staupitz, who we'll see in a minute, actually releases Luther from his vows, making him a free man. But the life of a monk was a hard one. And as we've seen, Luther chose a really rigorous order, an observant order. These were not the fat and lazy monks that we see in famous characters like Friar Tuck. They were not drinking and carousing and living in opulence. The Augustinians were observant, so that meant that Luther went about his day and his life following the rules to a T. Well, the evidence we have of what Luther was like as a monk reveals that he was essentially like every other monk. Now, he has plagues of doubt and anxiety, which we'll get into as we go through these lectures, and we'll see that Luther, in many ways, is the neurotic who took the system beyond perhaps what it was intended to do, but certainly within the reach of what it was allowed to do within the medieval Catholic system. But occasionally you hear allegations that Luther was not the best monk, that he was rebellious, or that he was carnal, or that he was somewhat lazy. Well, a lot of those allegations about Luther's life, as well as the allegations from his younger life that he was a disobedient child and always sort of angry with his parents, these kinds of things, were really things that were trumped up later by anti-Protestant and anti-Lutheran apologists. The fact is we don't know a great deal of Luther's personality or what went on during his years as a monk, which is a fair indication that not a whole lot of note actually went on personally. What we do know about Luther as a monk, he actually tells us later in life when he's a Protestant. So that has to be considered. The information we have of Luther as a monk, in other words, comes from Luther, and it comes at a time when he's already hostile to his former life. Luther tells us, quote, "If ever a monk could win heaven by monkery, I must have reached it." And this is the overall tone that Luther has later in life. He sees the monastic life that he had lived as essentially Pelagian, that is to say, as a life intended to earn your salvation fully. But what do we know about the day-in and day-out life of a monk that we can use as neutral evidence as to what Luther would have done day in and day out? Well, the life of a monk was relatively straightforward. The core of it, the impulse of the monastic life, was the renunciation of your will. Now, we have to be careful here because the concept of the will theologically will feature heavily in Luther's theology as we go forward, particularly after the Reformation. When we say here that there was the renunciation of the will, we might use 21st century language and say that the life of the monk was to forget about yourself and think of your calling instead. In other words, to be a monk meant that you were hanging up your hat in terms of determining your own life or your own progress. One of the core vows of all monks and nuns and anyone going into the monastic orders, all the way back to the beginning and all the way up until today, is the vow of obedience. And those who were not raised Catholic or who simply don't know the history sometimes chuckle at that, and they say, why does obedience have to be a vow? Does that mean anyone who's not a monk and who's Catholic is simply disobedient? Well, the word obedience in this case, and it would have been applied to Luther and the Augustinian order as well, is a vow to obey your superiors within the monastic order without question and promptly. You might say it's a bit like the modern military. It's sir, yes, sir. Orders are to be followed, they're not to be questioned. And in the life of the monk, that is the goal. And as we'll see going forward, Luther is relatively obedient to those who sort of guide his life, and they make decisions for him that affect the eventual outcome of both his academic life and his spiritual life. Well, as we said, the life of a monk would have been hard. It would have been hard work. Now, it would not have been torturous. This was not a time when people practiced silly things like self-flagellation or self-abuse in the physical sense. But the life of the monk was renunciation. They did not eat a lot. They fasted pretty frequently. They prayed incessantly. And in the hours when they weren't doing these things, they were either learning, reading, and studying, or they were engaged in manual labor. Now, that's true of all monastic orders. But one of the things you have to know about the history of monastic movements and of these different orders and all of these different names that we have, both historically and even today, in terms of monastic orders, groups like the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Augustinians, which Luther is a part of, the Jesuits, etc., is that often the groups will take on different tones, you might say, different emphases. And the Augustinians at this point, particularly the observant Augustinians in the area of Saxony, focused on education, and they were a mendicant order, which is not true of all orders. It doesn't have to be true, but in this case it was in the case of the observant Augustinians. And a mendicant order is an order that habitually practices begging. That is to say, it tries to hold no property or wealth or means within either the house and certainly not personally for each monk. Monks would live, we might say, hand to mouth. Luther tells us later that there were times when he had to go stand out on the street and beg for his daily bread, or beg on behalf of his brothers for the food for that day or week. Now, this was relatively routine. People in the community would expect the mendicant orders to be out there, being obviously still a Catholic system, still part of the ethos of the world, this still being pre-Reformation. It was considered to be a good work for lay Catholics to, when seeing a mendicant there, begging for his food, to supply him with bread or whatever he might need at the moment. So there was a bit of a social contract, you might say, where mendicant orders would beg and the Catholic populace would know why they're begging and would provide what they needed. But still, it was considered to be a humble work for a monk to beg. They didn't take endowments, they didn't take large amounts of money, they didn't live in opulence. Rather, they had to ask those in their communities to support them. Well, what about the routine of the day? What about prayers and these kinds of things? Well, the life of a monk often followed the daily office, as it's called. And this was a repeatable pattern throughout the day of praying what's called the hours. And they're called the hours because at particular appointed hours of the day, whatever the monks were doing, whether collectively or individually, they would cease from that labor and they would come together and they would pray. And the day either began or ended, depending on where you draw the clock, at 3 a.m. That was the first intonation of the call to prayer. It was the morning prayer. After which, often the monks would go back to their cells for a period of rest, maybe a quick nap, and at which point they would pray again at 6, they'd pray again at 9, they'd pray again at noon for the noonday meal, and so on and so forth, all the way throughout the day. Now, when we say that they would pray, there obviously would be extemporaneous prayers or times for personal prayer. But often in the monastic sense, praying the hours was more like engaging in a short liturgy. You would sing or read aloud the Psalms, for example, at a certain order and at a certain pacing. In fact, depending on the order and depending on how they broke it up, often the cycle of praying the hours meant that monks read through each of the Psalms within a span of roughly 6 weeks. Luther, to the end of his life, was dramatically shaped by this. He had the Psalms seemingly memorized. He knew them backwards and forwards. In fact, Luther holds the Psalms in about as high a regard as possible. He calls them essentially the Bible within the Bible at one point. Well, the variety of monastic orders and practices isn't so much shaped by the praying of the hours or by necessarily being mendicant. Often what shaped the variety of different orders is what they did in the in-between time. There have been historically monastic orders that practice more contemplative time in the off hours. Maybe they're in their cells fully quiet, completely isolated, cut off, these kinds of things. And you see this more in orders or monastic houses that bend a little bit more mystical, a little more spiritualist. Others would engage in manual labor. In fact, not a few students have always pointed out to me the number of culinary things that sort of hang on from the monastic orders from the Middle Ages, the most obvious of which is the crafting of certain types of beers and the long history of all kinds of things that monks would do, essentially because when they worked, sometimes they were working at the cultivation of livestock farms and, yes, breweries. Well, it wasn't always a farming life. Sometimes in the in-between hours, when they were not praying or resting or doing other things, strong manual labor was the rule of the day. For others, and in this case, this is true with Luther and the Augustinians, education became the focus of the off hours. Now, over the course of the Middle Ages and into the Reformation and post-Reformation eras, you often see a trading off of the baton as to which monastic order becomes the most intellectually rigorous or serious. In the High Middle Ages, it was in particular the Dominicans, though obviously there were serious minds in the Franciscan orders and the Augustinian orders. But since Aquinas and others come from the Dominican orders, they really had the pride of place in the Middle Ages in terms of intellectual prowess. After the Reformation, the baton is taken over, relatively speaking, by the Jesuits. And if you just look at the span of Catholic universities that are top-notch in America, just as a microcosm of this, if you just look at the heritage of those universities, in not a few cases, it was a Jesuit order or some Jesuit influence that gave rise to American Catholic universities. Not always, granted, but in many ways, the Jesuits took over the life of the mind and became serious thinkers and writers. And that carries on down until today. Well, in the observant Augustinian group, which is where Luther joined, the life of the mind, the life of education, a serious life of study, dominated the time between their praying of the hours. And as we said in our last lecture, one of the things that drew Luther into the monastery was the presence of a couple of his more influential voices and teachers in his life, who were themselves Augustinians. And this theme is carried on because as Luther enters the order, he continues his education. Now, he had taken a BA and an MA in more or less general studies, at least the foundational studies of the arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, we said. Well, after he enters the monastic order, he begins to continue his education into the area of Bible and theology. And this is very common. Once one has the foundation of a BA and an MA in the arts, in the sort of broad general studies of the humanities, then he could take on the study of theology. And so in March 1508, he took a BA in Bible, and the following year, in 1509, he took a BA, this time in the study of what's known as the sentences. And the sentences are a collection of, for lack of a better word, quotes or key passages or phrases from patristic and early medieval sources. And so the easy way to remember this is that the sentences is literally what the book is more or less made up of, in the sense that it's chunks of sentences and quotes from famous and influential theologians from the past. And this book, The Sentences, had been compiled by an enormously influential and important medieval theologian by the name of Peter Lombard. And really, in a manner of speaking, The Sentences was the core textbook that all systematic theologians, you might say, were supposed to master. And what Lombard had done in this book is he had put thematically what appeared at times to be competing ideas and theories side by side. In other words, he put theological issues in tension. And the goal of a theologian studying the sentences was to appreciate the patristic witness and the early medieval witness. And in places where there are tensions or apparent contradictions, you were supposed to come to a resolution dialectically that made the two sources not competitive against one another, but rather resolve them into a better answer that allowed both of them to be correct in different ways. It's a common educational practice two things side by side and you have to weigh them out. Frankly, it's exactly like this course here. Luther and Calvin, side by side, have to weigh them out. Only in the case of medieval theology, the Sentences was the supreme book for this. It was the only book of its kind. And so in 1509, Luther takes a BA in it. And it all culminates in 1512 when Luther is awarded the doctorate of Bible. Now, we'll pick all of this up in the next lecture when we look at Luther as a professor, what was his educational background, what did he learn from these texts, etc. But it's during his life as a monk, during these arduous years, when he's pursuing the monastic life, that Luther is developing these intellectual skills. In fact, for Luther, and this is important for his Reformation breakthrough, the pairing of rich, deep engagement theologically with his ongoing experience as a monk that sort of come together and fuse together and becomes this really combustible mix that explodes whenever Luther has his Reformation breakthrough, which we'll look at later. Now, a couple of myths before we add some more nuance to Luther as a monk. There are all kinds of allegations that are made about what it was like to have been in a monastic house. Often, frankly, these are Protestant, somewhat slanderous ways of looking at the monastic life. Just as we were saying in our lecture on the late medieval background, often what happens is the most scandalous cases get read over the entirety of the Catholic system. But also there are sort of urban legends that have popped up here and there, and I really just want to be a myth buster for one of them. And that is the common claim that when in a monastery you frankly had no exposure to the Bible, that it just simply was nothing you read or engaged with. And this is often put in such a way that people say that if there was a Bible, it would be chained up in a library and unable to be accessed by people. And so you get this somewhat bonkers theory that people in the Middle Ages simply were unaware of what the Bible had to say, that all they cared about is what Aquinas or someone else had to say. And the misstep here is they almost believe that what Luther does in his Reformation breakthrough is become the first man in a millennia to read the Bible for the first time. As if no one read Galatians or Romans before that. Well, as we'll see in our lecture actually on Luther's Reformation breakthrough, Luther read Romans consistently. He read it all the time. And we just said that they prayed through the Psalms repeatedly, and that's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of not only biblical engagement, but biblical memorization. No, the Bible was very commonly studied. In fact, it was studied, frankly, significantly more in-depthly than we see in many 21st century contexts. And ironically, the Bible was chained up, yes, but it was chained up because it was so popular that people would walk off with it. They would steal it. They would take it somewhere and hide it because they wanted to read it, or they'd take it back to their cell if they weren't attempting to actually steal it. You don't chain things up no one wants or no one's using. You chain things up that people actually really want. And beyond that, Bibles were incredibly expensive. Their price goes down dramatically over the course of the Reformation as the movable type printing press begins to pick up steam and really dramatically ease the burden of the production of books. But this myth is also exploded by the fact that Luther got 2 BAs and one of them was in Bible. And then he received his doctorate in Bible as well. And again, we'll cover what Luther's engagement was with Scripture in a later lecture. But the life of the monk, and in particular Luther's life as an Augustinian observant friar, was dramatically committed to learning both theology and Scripture. Now, we have said, and we are going to continue to stress this, Luther did not enjoy his life as a monk. So to begin with, we do need to say that during his time as a monk, Luther experienced a pretty profound crisis, not only in terms of his anxiety, you might almost say from a neurophysical standpoint, he experienced serious physical manifestations of his anxiety, but also from a spiritual side. Luther simply could not come to terms with what he felt were the demands of the penitential system upon him. And that crisis forms the context of the theological and personal breakthrough that Luther has, which we'll cover in a bit. But I want to highlight right now one aspect of Luther in the monastery that introduces into his thinking and into his personal life the first voice of, you might say, reason or of pastoral insight that he had ever had in the fullest sense. And that was the person of Johann von Staupitz. Now, Staupitz is somewhat legendary. He is Luther's confessor. That is to say, he is the man Luther is required to during the process of confession and penance, etc. It's Staupitz that Luther goes to confide in. Now, Luther didn't have to make him his confessor. Staupitz and Luther meet actually for the first time in 1506. And Staupitz was actually a big deal. He was actually very influential and very important. Staupitz was the vicar general of the observant Augustinians. Not only that, but Staupitz was also an intellectual. In 1502, Staupitz became actually the founding dean of the University of Wittenberg, which is, of course, where Luther will end up both living but also as a professor, and it's a job that he'll hold to the end of his life. Staupitz was the founding dean of that university. Well, the two of them meet in 1506, and Luther is drawn like a moth to the flame to Staupitz. Luther just feels relatively compelled to pursue Staupitz because, in a manner of speaking, he feels that Staupitz can help him. And a lot of people have gone into Staupitz's theology to try to determine what kind of things did Staupitz believe that would give shape to Luther's theology, both pastorally and theologically. Because again, Staupitz is not just a pastor, he's also an intellectual. Well, several of the books and subjects that Staupitz wrote on included the doctrines of predestination, the role of good works, and Christian love. And scholars again and again have pointed out, Staupitz's ideas are not intended to cause a reformation, but they are fertile soil and important ideas that speak into Luther's crisis and his anxiety in ways that provide some of the kindling, you might say, for Luther's eventual Reformation breakthrough. Now, Staupitz himself never became a Protestant. This is important. He is sometimes called a forerunner to the Reformation. In traditional Lutheran churches, there's actually a feast day in which Staupitz is honored and remembered. But Staupitz actually never became Protestant. He repudiated the Reformation, actually, in a manner of speaking, though he himself never repudiated Luther in the fullest sense. Also, importantly, in 1559, the works of Staupitz on these subjects of predestination and works and love, etc., were placed officially on the Index of Banned Books, which is a list that was around from the Middle Ages, and it carried on until long after the Reformation. And these were books that Catholics were not allowed to read without a license. Now, a lot of Catholics did get that license, particularly if they were academics or theologians or scholars, but these are books that were not supposed to be put in layman's hands in particular. Now, that's important because the Catholic Church eventually somewhat blames Staupitz for his role in shaping Luther. Erasmus, by the way, will suffer the same fate. His books aren't placed in the ban, but his name is dragged through the mud for his role in shaping humanism and eventually shaping the minds and the hearts of so many eventual Protestants. But Staupitz is enormously important for the formation of Luther as a monk. Luther himself actually says, quote, "If it had not been for Dr. Staupitz, I should have sunk into hell." Now, just what did Staupitz teach him? Well, Staupitz actually was something of what we call an intensified Augustinian, which is certainly understandable because this is the Augustinian order after all. But scholars have noted that there is this move in the latter Middle Ages, and even back to the earlier part of the Middle Ages, of a minority opinion, you might say, on the issues of predestination, love, and works. And it draws from the Augustinian heritage, and it says basically, works are somewhat important for the Christian life, but not ultimately important. And in a manner of speaking, this is what Staupitz speaks into Luther's mind. Over time, he says, Luther, stop caring so much about your own will and your own heart. Those things are fickle and false. Rather, look to the work of Christ. Look what Christ has done for you. He's done the work. And you can see in that the kernel of Luther's eventual doctrine of justification by faith alone. In other words, it didn't spring into Luther's mind almost out of nowhere. Luther's main pastoral voice was saying to him, stop caring so much about your bloody soul and your bloody will and your inability to do X, Y, or Z, and focus instead on the merits and the mercy of Christ that he has already done on your behalf. Now, Luther's Reformation breakthrough is not dependent on Staupitz again. Staupitz actually himself in 1520 comes under serious fire for this. The Pope actually pressures Staupitz at one point, not only to call Luther to heel, but to recant himself for the way that he shaped Luther. And this is important because Staupitz actually refuses to recant. He doesn't do so defiantly, but he refuses to recant because in his own mind, and he defends himself on this point, he didn't actually give Luther the Reformation ideas. He gave him, he thought, standard Augustinian pastoral advice to look to the merits of Christ. In the end, Staupitz died in 1524, just a number of years after the Reformation is in full bloom. And in his last letter to Staupitz, Staupitz is a bit grumpy. He does wish that Luther would recant and return to the church. But he also expresses to Luther his love. and he encourages Luther to ignore inconsequential ideas and instead to fight for the important ones. And you see in there a little bit of a microcosm of the relationship. Staupitz was fond of Luther. He had given him, he felt to the day he died, good pastoral advice, which is to look to Christ. And though Staupitz didn't join Luther's Reformation, still, Staupitz's influence on Luther as a monk was profoundly important, because without Staupitz, even by Luther's own admission, Luther would have descended further and further into the anxiety that plagued him. Now, one last wrinkle, which we'll pick up in our next lecture. During the turmoil that Luther is going through, Staupitz does a relatively smart pastoral principle, which is he tries to get Luther to stop worrying about himself and start thinking about something else instead. Stop focusing on yourself, and let's get your hands and your mind busy on something else, and maybe you'll calm down. Well, one of the things Staupitz does, again, as vicar general and as a scholar himself, is he pushes Luther into the doctorate. In this day and age, particularly if you're a monk, you don't simply declare that you want to do a doctorate. Rather, people call on you and push you forward in many cases to do a doctorate. Luther actually tells us that he protested somewhat, that he didn't want to become a professor or a doctor. But Staupitz, sensing that Luther needed something else to chew on besides the cankers of his own heart, pushed Luther towards the professor's life. And in 1512, just as Luther earns his doctorate in Bible, Staupitz resigns his post at the University of Wittenberg and puts Luther in that position. And so the influence of both the monastic life, and in particular of Staupitz as Luther's confessor and mentor, is profound in shaping the context of his eventual education and his Reformation breakthrough. Okay, that's it. Next lecture, we're going to be looking at Luther as a professor. What was he teaching? What was his intellectual climate like? How did he come to his views from an educational standpoint?